The training for today is Module 1.0, the Introduction to LID for Eastern Washington. So how we've broken up the morning is doing an introduction, so a little bit more background about our learning objectives for the day. The second section, which is the regulatory and Eastern Washington overview. In that section, we'll get into the permit and permit language and what the permit means for Eastern Washington. This third section is the purpose and principles of LID, and that's where we'll get into the definition, what is LID and what does it mean to you guys. Then we'll follow that up with best management practices, so specific tools in the LID toolkit. So those are things like bioretention, rainwater harvesting. So we'll cover all those BMPs in that fourth section. And then the fifth section is just a wrap-up. So getting started, the learning objectives. We have 4 main learning objectives for this training. And the first learning objective, understanding the basic LID principles and practices. So we'll cover this during the purpose and principles section of the agenda. The second learning objective, that general knowledge of on-the-ground LID practices. Then the third learning objective, understanding the current permit requirements. That we'll cover in the regulatory piece of the agenda. And then the final learning objective, which is beyond this course, what additional resources are available to you. So moving right into the regulatory and Eastern Washington overview. We'll be covering the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System Municipal Stormwater Permit. It's a mouthful. We just call it the NPDES permit for Eastern Washington. We'll also be talking about flow control and treatment performance standards, as well as LID requirements. Other standards that are part of the stormwater world are combined sewer overflow limits, which we won't be covering today, but that is a regulatory driver for jurisdictions that have combined sewer systems. Local jurisdictions sometimes have their own stormwater standards and requirements, so we won't be covering those as well. So in 1972, the federal government passed the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act is the primary federal law governing water pollution. The goal behind the Clean Water Act is to make our waterways around the country fishable and swimmable. The NPDES permit is part of the Clean Water Act. The NPDES permit program controls water pollution by regulating point sources that discharge pollution and pollutants into waters in the U.S. So it's dealing with point source issues and is a regulatory requirement, regulatory driver as well. And if you discharge stormwater directly from a point source, so from, for example, from a pipe, then into receiving water bodies, that jurisdiction or that entity needs a permit. And there are 4 different categories of the NPDES permit. There is a municipal permit, a construction, industrial NPDES permit, and a boatyards permit. And the permit that we'll be covering today is the municipal NPDES permit. And the permit authority is delegated to the Washington State Department of Ecology, so by EPA. So as part of the permit, there are Phase 1 permittees and there are Phase 2 permittees. And what that means is if you're a Phase 1 jurisdiction and you have a Phase 1 permit, and it means that it's basically based on size. So for populations greater than or equal to 100,000 people, you are part of a Phase 1 permit. For populations greater than 10,000 people, you're considered a Phase 2 permittee. And the issuance date of the Phase 2 municipal stormwater permit this round was August 1st of 2012. And this new permit went into effect just last month, so August 1st of 2014. And the permit term is a 5-year term. So this Phase 2 municipal stormwater permit for Eastern Washington will be with us through July 31st of 2019. So here is a list. We've got 18 cities and portions of 6 counties that are Phase 2 permittees in Eastern Washington. There are no Phase 1 jurisdictions in Eastern Washington. And right now there's a really strong emphasis on updating codes and regulations to allow for low-impact development. And Eastern Washington jurisdictions have until December of 2017 to allow LID techniques, to create measures to minimize the creation of impervious surfaces, as well as to identify measures to minimize the disturbance of native vegetation and native soils. So there are 8 core elements, and the definition of what a core element is it's a fundamental required component of stormwater design. And so there are 8 listed here. The 2 that we will be focusing on are core element number 5, which is runoff treatment, and core element number 6, which is flow control. And the reason why we're focusing on those 2 core elements it is because those are the 2 core elements that low impact development is working to address, and the tools in the LID toolkit are working to address. So what do we mean by runoff treatment? We mean water quality treatment for pollution generating surfaces, and to reduce pollutant loads and concentrations in stormwater runoff to protect our water quality. And then core element number 6, flow control, is controlling the flow peaks and flow durations. So the intensity of the flow as well as the length of the flow. So how long are the rain events? Threshold is if you have a new development that's greater than or equal to 5,000 square feet of pollution generating impervious surface, then core element number 5 comes into play, and it triggers this core element. As well as redevelopment with greater than or equal to 5,000 square feet of pollution generating impervious surface for specific industrial, commercial, high use, and high traffic sites. So what does this mean actually on the ground? So if your new development or your redevelopment meets one of those criteria, then the standards for treatment, so treating 90% of the annual runoff, as well as specific treatment requirements based on site type as well as location. So for basic total suspended solids, for metals such as dissolved copper and zinc, phosphorus, and oil. There are some exemptions. So if your site, your new development or your redevelopment that meets those thresholds, and you are able to satisfy full dispersion, then it really is the most cost effective, but it requires quite a bit of space. So it's not always realistic for developments to be able to satisfy this full dispersion exemption. But if you can do it, that's really fantastic. Another basic treatment exemption is discharges to, the runoff discharges to a qualified UIC facility, and that is underground injection control device. And so there's a basic treatment exemption there if that's where your runoff is being discharged to. Also, metal treatment exemptions, discharges non-fish-bearing streams, as well as discharges to main channels of certain rivers and lakes. So in the Stormwater Management Manual for Eastern Washington from 2004, there's actually a list of lakes and rivers and water bodies that are exempt, and as well as subsurface discharges and restricted residential employee-only parking areas. So moving right along, moving into core element number 6, this is flow control. So this is dealing with the volume and velocity of the rain event and of water. So what triggers core element number 6? If there's a new development with greater than or equal to 10,000 square feet of new impervious surfaces, then it triggers core element number 6. Core element number 6 is not required for redevelopment unless required under a basin plan or other federal, state, or local requirements. Before you're embarking on any of these projects, to really look at your local jurisdictions, codes, and requirements before launching into your project. So what is the standard here? The standard is based on pre-development conditions, so prior to settlement or existing condition. And the goal is really to mitigate to the maximum extent practicable the impacts of increased stormwater runoff and flow rates on streams in Eastern Washington. And just as in core element number 5, the runoff treatment, core element number 6, flow control, also has several exemptions. And one of the exemptions is if you disperse a total of 25-year runoff volume without any discharge, then you're exempt from the standard that I just mentioned, as well as discharge to irrigation return flow reaches. And the third bullet, these exempt water, surface waters. And again, that list in the Stormwater Management Manual for Eastern Washington is a good resource to look to see what water bodies fall under that category. Finally, the other 2 exemptions that we'll just mention today, discharge to a wetland with no surface water outlet is another exemption, And the final exemption that we'll mention today, discharge to a stream that flows only during runoff producing events. And now we're moving into the standard around low impact development. Low impact development, and this is the language from the new permit that just came into effect this past August. For new development and redevelopment, the permittees shall allow non-structural preventative actions and source reduction approaches such as LED techniques, measures to minimize the creation of impervious surfaces, and measures to minimize the disturbance of native soils and vegetation. By December 31st of 2017, Eastern Washington Phase 2 permittees must retain runoff generated on site for at a minimum the 10-year 24-hour rain event or local equivalent. Some Eastern Washington jurisdictions already require stormwater to be retained on site. So there are a lot of folks that are already doing this on the ground. And a majority of Eastern Washington permittees have adopted ordinances that meet or closely approximate the EPA LID standard prior to this new LID language being added to the permit that just went into effect of 2014. Department of Ecology has grants that are available to help jurisdictions with design and implementation of LID projects. And the other two standards that I mentioned earlier that are also drivers around stormwater management, the combined sewer overflow limits, as well as local jurisdictions and the standards that local jurisdictions may have about CSO reduction efforts and conveyance capacity. And these are other standards that we are not covering today. I know Wenatchee does not have a combined sewer system. Spokane has one, and so that is a regulatory driver for them to manage stormwater and potentially to use low impact development as part of their toolkit for the CSO requirement. To one overflow event per outfall per year, which is the federal requirement. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Dustin, and Dustin is going to talk about Eastern Washington and give an Eastern Washington overview.
I do a lot of work at my CH2M Hill in Bellevue. We do a lot of green infrastructure work, mostly on infrastructure projects or in the right-of-way, a lot of times in a retrofit situation, so that adds a lot of complexity to the work. And I got into this work really because I was doing a lot of stormwater projects that was putting stormwater into pipes and then piping it and looking for right-of-way places to put a pond in and then build a fence around that pond for one single purpose, which was to retain flow. And it just, as the LID was starting to kind of come out, became kind of an idea of like, this is a better technique. This is a better tool set to maximize value on the site developments, and a way to actually better protect the environment by doing more than just one function at a time. And that's kind of really what LID really is, and kind of where, when we talk to you about Eastern Washington, you've been doing a lot of the main core elements of low impact development already. Things such as open ditch conveyance and infiltration and all of that. And really what we're talking about with LID is really taking it to the next evolutionary level and making those techniques more effective for protecting groundwater if you're doing infiltration, spreading the infiltration surface out more than just being at a single dry well, but using bioretention in other areas throughout the landscape, so you're not building that infrastructure and piping it to those locations. And maybe in some locations reusing that water for another benefit, things along those lines. Certainly what really defines that is what are the local conditions? What are the limitations for whether low impact development is feasible or going to work in the context of your projects? So this is just a general map. There's generally 4 climatic regions in Eastern Washington, so we can't just talk about Eastern Washington in a broad scope and say it's all the same. We're kind of right here, kind of right around region 2, 1, and 3 actually, kind of a transitional area here. From a climate perspective, a lot of variation in how much rainfall falls or precipitation falls in Eastern Washington, anywhere from 6 inches per year in kind of the Yakima region to even 60 inches per hour in some per year. Per hour would be crazy. It'd be a hurricane. In any case. But yeah, there's quite a bit of variation. So we need to be very aware of what those local climate patterns are depending on where you are. Here's just kind of a summary of the total annual snowfall. So snow happens. So snow is something that's very important to consider in low impact development, because where are you going to store that snow? How is that snow going to affect the performance of that facility and its long-term O&M considerations for how you manage those facilities, such as porous pavements. Here in Wenatchee, it's about 27.6 inches per year of snowfall, which is kind of right about in the middle of most of the areas in the Eastern Washington. So the native vegetation is also very important. We're doing many of these practices. We don't want to be adding irrigation to them. We don't want to be actually having to manage them a lot. So native vegetation is usually our number one tool for how we vegetate these facilities. So, we have a number of different kind of expressions of that native vegetation. We have prairie, pine forest, shrub, steppe, channeled scabland, dry and irrigated agricultural land. So a little bit of a drier palette generally in eastern Washington, that you do want to use that. And one of the considerations is when you are building a facility, first off, it's very hard to establish native vegetation. So preserving the native vegetation is one of the key techniques. But when you have to kind of reestablish native vegetation is looking around at nurseries and seeing where that native vegetation is available. So that could be something to be very early in design and planning for projects, is considering where you're going to get those materials. Soils are really the number one consideration for a low impact development. As you've all said, infiltration is kind of the key. This is a map of all of eastern Washington of just the soil classifications. This is the Natural Resource Conservation Service mapping. So it's generally the surface soils. These were mapping done for agriculture. We do have to not only consider the surface soils, but the underlying geology when we're doing this work. But in general, Class A soils can be effective for low impact development, but it's so rapid we also need to provide water quality before we infiltrate in those areas. Class B soils are really the ideal soils for doing low impact development. It's adequately drained, but it also isn't so fast that you have to worry about the water quality considerations. And then Class C can be done in some locations, but you may have to put in additional considerations, maybe additional flow control because you can't get it all into the ground, or you need to have under drains to help protect that facility. And I think what's important again is the local knowledge. I come from kind of on the border of B and C soils, but I could tell you from digging a lot of holes growing up that it's clay. So it's Class D soils. So, even though it's mapped is one thing, the exploration that goes into it is something that's very important for determining whether or not it's feasible. Next few slides are just kind of to show that eastern Washington isn't absolutely unique. There are other locations that have similar climate considerations as eastern Washington. I did my grad school research in Wisconsin, doing grain garden research back in 2002 and 2004, which is a little bit more similar here than in Seattle, obviously. We have a lot more of the snowfall, a lot more of the thunderstorm delivery of this precipitation in the summer. And, that's pretty similar across the nation. So, in eastern Washington here, you have other areas, the Northeast, the Midwest, that also have snowfall. And there are great resources from other universities and other locations that give you good information about how to deal with cold weather climates and low impact development. The country also has similar temperature patterns. This is one on how cold does it get. So again, areas that are less than 35 degrees or less than 25 degrees. And again, the growing season is another key consideration. It's similar to other parts of the country. What makes low impact development being in eastern Washington unique? What are some of the particular challenges that maybe I didn't address here that you see when you're thinking about low impact development that you see on a lot of projects? Why people say we can't do it? In summary, that the native vegetation is not what people's expectation of native vegetation is. Typically, they're looking for lush vegetation, grass, things along those lines. And when we talk about native vegetation, it's a different palette, and it takes people a while to get used to that. Any other considerations in eastern Washington that you see as like barriers? Being a lot of design examples and guidance comes from other climates in the western side of the state, and you're kind of breaking new ground in some locations in eastern Washington, and that's a big challenge for developers to be the first in line to do that work.